Imagine handing over 5% of everything you own just because you live in a certain state.
Yeah, I mean, it
Yep.
sounds like some kind of hypothetical thought experiment, right?
Right.
But it's very real. And right now, it is splitting one of the largest economies in the world right down the middle.
We're looking at a pretty brutal reality for California today. The state faces this massive $19 billion budget deficit.
Huge hole.
And this emergency comes directly from recent federal cuts to healthcare and food programs. The money simply stopped flowing from Washington.
Just dried up.
Exactly. So to fix this massive hole, a new ballot initiative is hitting the streets. It's called the 2026 Billionaire Tax Act.
And it squarely targets the state's wealthiest residents.
Right. So if voters pass this in November 2026, the law slaps a one-time 5% tax on anyone worth more than $1 billion.
Which is unprecedented.
It really is. So today we're doing a deep dive. We're ripping into the actual bill text, the economic reports, and the fierce backlash from Silicon Valley.
Yeah, there's a lot of backlash.
Oh, totally. We want to help you understand the facts, the fury, and the constitutional landmines of this historic wealth tax.
And the numbers driving this initiative are they're absolutely staggering.
Yeah.
When you look at the research provided by the bill's proponents, you realize just how concentrated wealth has actually become.
Because it's not hitting that many people, right?
No, not at all. This tax targets an incredibly small group. We're talking roughly 200 to 250 billionaires living in California.
200 people out of nearly 40 million residents.
Exactly. But taxing that tiny group generates an estimated $100 billion over 5 years.
Wow. Okay, so that breaks down to about 20 billion annually.
Yep. And the text of the bill strictly dictates where those billions go.
Where does it go?
So 90% flows directly into healthcare programs like medical.
Right.
And then the remaining 10% funds K-14 education and food assistance.
Let's back up for a second because I want to make sure I understand the real catalyst for this.
Sure.
You mentioned federal cuts earlier. The reports we looked at keep citing this acronym, the OBBBA.
Yes, OBBA.
What actually happened there to cause a $19 billion crisis?
So OBBA stands for the Omnibus Budget and Benefits Balancing Act.
Okay.
It was a massive federal spending reduction package that recently passed in Washington.
Right.
Basically, the federal government just slashed the matching funds they send to states for safety net programs.
Oh, wow. So when Washington pulls the plug on healthcare funding, the state is just left holding the bag.
Exactly. And proponents of the Billionaire Tax Act argue that this new revenue is literally the only thing standing between 1.6 million Californians and the total loss of their health insurance.
So it operates almost like an emergency exit toll for the ultra-rich, just to keep the state's social safety net from collapsing.
Yeah, that is exactly how the proponents frame it. And, the economists defending the bill, they bring up some really fascinating math to justify that toll.
What kind of math?
Well, they look at the actual burden of taxation. According to their data, billionaires currently pay about 1.3% of their true wealth in taxes.
1.3%.
Right. Meanwhile, the average American pays closer to 30% of their income.
But wait, taxing wealth is fundamentally different than taxing a paycheck, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Like if I make $100,000, you tax that cash. But a billionaire's wealth isn't just sitting in a checking account.
Right. It's tied up in stock value, real estate, companies.
Which leads to what I think is maybe the biggest aha moment in these economic reports.
It's all about the mechanics of how wealth actually grows.
Right.
Proponents point out that billionaire wealth historically grows at an average rate of 7.5% every single year.
Just compounding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Their assets just continuously compound in value. So now look at the proposed tax. It takes 5% of their total net worth.
Okay.
But it doesn't force them to pay it all at once. It actually allows them to pay it in 1% annual installments over 5 years.
Hold on. Let me just do the math here out loud.
Go for it.
Their wealth grows by 7.5% a year.
Right.
The state takes 1% a year.
Yep.
That means, wait, they aren't actually losing money.
They are not. If those historical averages hold, a billionaire paying this historic, completely unprecedented tax still sees their overall net worth go up by 6.5% that year.
That's wild.
The tax doesn't actually shrink their total fortune. It just slightly slows down how fast that fortune grows.
That completely flips the perspective for me. If they're still getting richer, Why is there such absolute panic in Silicon Valley?
Oh, the panic is real.
Yeah, because when you read the responses from tech founders, I mean, they act like the sky is falling.
Well, the panic really comes from the mechanics of valuation. Because this tax grabs so much money from so few people, prominent tech leaders like David Sachs, Reid Hoffman, and even Governor Gavin Newsom, they are aggressively fighting the bill.
What's their main argument?
They argue it destroys California's competitive edge. But the most specific, intense fear comes from the venture capital world.
Right, Gary Tan. He's a major venture capitalist, and he claims that founders could lose 50% of their companies if this passes.
Yeah, that number gets thrown around a lot.
I read that and immediately thought, wait, how does a 5% tax equal a 50% loss? Make that make sense to me.
It comes down to something called super voting stock. Let's break down how that actually works.
Okay.
Imagine you start a tech company. To raise money, you sell off financial pieces of the company to investors.
Makes sense.
Eventually, you might only own, say, 10% of the actual financial value of the company.
Right.
However, to keep control of your invention, you structure your 10% as super voting shares.
Okay. Meaning what?
That means even though you only own 10% of the money, you control 51% of the voting power. You are still the boss.
Okay, I follow. I own a small piece of the pie financially, but I make all the decisions.
Exactly. So opponents of the bill are terrified that California will tax them based on their voting power, not their financial equity.
Oh.
Yeah. If a company is worth $10 billion and you control 51% of the votes, the state might say your asset is actually worth $5.1 billion.
And a 5% tax on that is what, over $250 million?
Right. But remember, your actual financial stake is only 10%, which is $1 billion.
So paying $250 million in taxes wipes out a massive chunk of your actual real-world wealth.
Exactly. That is how Tan gets to that 50% panic number.
Wow. Okay, yeah, if the state actually did that, it would completely break the startup ecosystem.
They would.
But I have the bill text right in front of me, and it seems like the people who wrote this anticipated that exact argument.
They absolutely did.
The text clearly states that publicly traded stock is taxed at its standard market value.
Right.
And for private founders, there's a massive safeguard. If the state's mathematical formula overvalues their supervoting shares, the founder can just submit a certified independent appraisal to prove their true financial worth.
And the state is required to use that certified appraisal instead.
Exactly. So it feels like the opponents are just ignoring the actual text of the bill to focus on a worst-case scenario.
Yeah, well, that happens frequently when the stakes are this high. But even with those safeguards, the broader fear of capital flight remains the loudest economic argument.
Capital flight, meaning they just leave.
Right. Critics insist that if you try to tax these 200 billionaires, they'll simply take their companies, their jobs, their tax revenue, and move to Texas or Florida.
Which raises an incredibly obvious question for me.
What's that?
If I'm a billionaire and I see this on the November ballot, couldn't I just pack my bags, change my driver's license to Nevada the day before the election, and avoid the whole thing?
You would think so.
Yeah.
But the drafters of the initiative built a very clever trapdoor into the legislation.
A trapdoor.
Yeah. The tax obligation does not depend on where you live in November when the voters actually go to the polls.
Okay.
It uses a January 1st, 2026 residency snapshot.
Oh.
The state effectively takes a picture of who lives in California on New Year's Day. If you're a resident on January 1st, you owe the tax if the bill passes in November.
So leaving the state anytime after New Year's Day doesn't cancel your bill?
No, doesn't. Doesn't cancel it.
That is wild. They lock you in 10 months before the election even happens.
They do. And, there's another layer to this capital flight argument. The economic reports provided by proponents cite historical studies showing that the ultra-wealthy actually relocate at very low rates.
Really? Even with high taxes?
Yeah. Packing up a massive global company, moving highly specialized engineering teams, and leaving that unique Silicon Valley network, it's incredibly difficult and expensive.
That makes sense.
Statistically, even when taxes go up, the rich mostly stay put. The infrastructure they need to make their billions is firmly anchored in California.
Okay, so if these billionaires can't physically run from the tax, and moving doesn't erase the bill anyway, where do they go?
They go to court.
Exactly. Looking at the legal analyses in our sources, this bill is stepping into a constitutional minefield.
Oh, a massive one.
Let's look at that January 1st trapdoor again. Opponents are arguing this violates the Due Process Clause, right?
Yes. The Due Process Clause basically ensures that laws are applied fairly. and people have notice of what's required of them.
Right.
Opponents argue that taxing someone based on a January residency for a law that didn't even exist until November is an illegal retroactive tax. You are taxing them for a past status.
It sounds like a referee penalizing a player for a foul that happened before the whistle even blew.
That's a great way to put it.
And that isn't the only federal challenge. What's the Dormant Commerce Clause argument? I saw that mentioned repeatedly in the legal briefs.
Right, so the Dormant Commerce Clause prevents individual states from passing legislation that improperly burdens or discriminates against interstate commerce.
Okay, so basically, California can't pass a law that messes with the economies of other states.
Exactly. And challengers argue that taxing a billionaire's worldwide assets illegally reaches wealth generated completely outside of California's borders.
Got it.
If a tech founder in San Francisco owns a manufacturing plant in Germany or real estate in New York, California is trying to tax the value of those assets.
And opponents argue the state has absolutely zero jurisdictional right to do that.
Right.
Keeping with the sports analogy, it's like penalizing a player for a foul before the whistle blew in a game happening in a completely different stadium.
Spot on. And the hurdles at the state level seem just as fierce.
Yeah, California law has very strict protections for property owners, doesn't it?
Very strict. There's a cap on property taxes at 0.04%.
And a 5% tax completely shatters that limit.
Completely shatters it.
So how does the bill even survive its first day in state court?
Well, this is where the legal strategy of the proponents is quite brilliant. To bypass those state laws, they didn't just write a regular bill.
What did they do?
They structured this initiative as a constitutional amendment. If the voters pass it, it literally rewrites the California Constitution.
No way.
Yeah, it specifically authorizes the state to ignore the 0.04% property tax cap for this exact situation.
So they aren't just breaking the rules, they're rewriting the entire rule book so that their play is suddenly legal.
Precisely. And furthermore, they carefully labeled it an excise tax on the activity of sustaining wealth.
Instead of calling it a standard property tax.
Exactly. An excise tax is usually a tax on a specific event or privilege, like buying gasoline.
Right.
They are legally framing the mere existence of a billion-dollar fortune as a taxable privilege.
That is a massive legal leap.
It is, and it sets up a monumental clash between state power and federal protections.
Which protections specifically?
Opponents will definitely invoke the Federal Takings Clause. That's the part of the U.S. Constitution that prevents the government from seizing private property for public use without just compensation. They'll argue this tax crosses the line from taxation into outright confiscation, forcing a tiny fraction of citizens to single-handedly bear the financial burden of an entire state.
And what about that January 1st thing?
They might even argue it violates the fundamental right to travel, because the January snapshot penalizes people simply for choosing to live in California at the start of the year.
But, I mean, constitutional lawsuits take years to wind their way through the Supreme Court.
Decades, sometimes.
The billionaires fighting this don't want to wait for a judge. They want to kill this at the ballot box in November before it ever becomes a law.
Which explains the massive propaganda war currently exploding on the ground in California.
Exactly. The messaging strategies we're seeing are incredibly aggressive.
Very aggressive.
You have political action groups like Reform California pushing a massive counter-initiative. They call it the Stop the Savings Tax campaign.
Right, and their core message warns everyday citizens that greedy politicians won't stop with billionaires. They'll come for the middle class next.
And the money fueling this PR push is absolutely absurd. I was looking at the donor lists, and a political action committee funded by tech executives just received a $45 million donation from Google co-founder Sergey Brin alone.
$45 million.
Yeah. And they are taking that money and sending mailers directly to senior citizens, claiming that everyday 401k retirement accounts and life savings are at risk of being taxed.
It's a very specific tactic.
Right. I mean, spending $45 million just to print scary flyers for seniors.
Well, think about it. To a billionaire facing a 5% wealth tax, $45 million is a very cheap insurance policy.
Yeah, that's true.
If that donation stops the bill, the return on investment is massive. But, proponents of the wealth tax are calling these mailers a deliberate, fabricated lie.
Because the text of the Billionaire Tax Act explicitly targets only individuals with a net worth over $1 billion.
Exactly. Furthermore, the bill specifically exempts most pensions, retirement accounts, and direct real estate from the calculation entirely.
So your 401k is legally protected by the very text of the law.
Yes.
So if the law clearly protects seniors, why spend $45 million to scare them?
Because of the political math. taxing 200 billionaires to fund healthcare for 1.6 million people. That is a highly popular concept.
Right. The math is totally against the billionaires there.
Exactly. If the opponents fight this purely on the math, they lose. 200 people cannot win a statewide election.
True.
To win, they have to convince the other 40 million residents that the tax is actually aimed at them. It's the classic slippery slope argument.
Right. You make the voter believe that the billionaire is just the first domino to fall.
Win on fear when you can't win on math.
Wow.
Meanwhile, the proponents are using their own form of emotional framing. They paint the billionaires as tax-dodging hoarders who refuse to pay their fair share, while local public hospitals face total closure.
It's intense on both sides. And again, just to remind you listening, our goal here isn't to declare a winner or take sides on the politics, but just to expose how both sides are using the stakes to manipulate the public narrative.
Absolutely. Both sides are playing hard.
So, looking at everything we have unpacked today, what is the core takeaway for the listener? We are watching a $100 billion showdown.
I think the underlying tension here is profound, and it highlights a crisis facing many modern economies.
Oh, so?
On one side, you have a state desperate for revenue, trying to protect its most vulnerable citizens from severe federal cuts.
Right.
But on the other side, you have robust constitutional protections against government property seizure and the legitimate economic fear that aggressive taxation will destroy the very innovation that made California a global powerhouse.
It all circles back to that opening reality, handing over 5% of everything you own.
Exactly.
If California successfully navigates these constitutional landmines and manages to tax unsold, unrealized wealth, it raises a massive question.
A historic one.
Does this create a permanent, tested blueprint for a federal wealth tax across the entire country? Or does it fundamentally break the relationship between a state and the innovators who build its economy?
That is something every taxpayer in every state should be watching closely.